All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone here, all the gardeners and gourmands, to our program this evening, featuring Mr. Scott Hucker here of Great Lakes Staple Seeds. We hope you'll enjoy what Mr. Hucker has to share with us. And keep in mind, our seed library is gladly accepting seed donations. So as you're starting to take down the gardens, please bring us a little something that you grew. We'd very much appreciate to share it with our patrons. We are ramping up some big programs for October, so be sure to check our library calendar found on the website right at the top. Attend events, links right to our calendar. And I believe that's all of my housekeeping. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you very much.
Okay, to host a disabled participant screen sharing. Still says it's disabled. Your sound is on. Host disabled participant screen sharing. Picked up formal people.
I understand. Here we go. There we go.
That changed everything.
There we and Eleanor. There we go. Sorry about that, folks. That was my fault. Now we can see. Wonderful.
You can see my pictures?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. There we go. So I've got a lot of slides and I will invariably talk fast, but at the end, I will show you where we posted this presentation. So you can download a PDF of everything I'm showing you. And this growing small scale grain growing, I've organized this like a calendar because everything in the garden is very seasonal. So what to do and when to do it, I've organized it using some medieval pictures that I found on the internet. And conveniently, it's the fall, so we're actually right on time. This is a very timely topic. I will begin planting my fall grains in about 29 days. So a little bit about myself. When I was in high school in 1984, I had a horrible decision to make. I had interests that were conflicting. I either wanted to be an aerospace engineer and work at NASA or a horticultural plant breeder. And in the end, I chose, my guidance counselor suggested I do engineering as a job and do plants as a hobby. It'll work much better that way than vice versa. So I ended up working at General Motors here in Michigan since 1994, lived all over the world, and I essentially schedule my vacations now by the weather. If it's nice out, I take a half a day in the afternoon and go work in the dirt. As well, I lived all over the world. Whenever I'm traveling, I like to look at how people grow their food. This happens to be some terraces that are in China. If the internet connection is unstable, you may have to disconnect them. So we live up by Ortonville, and we have solar on our barn roof, and we have an electric car, and I use Bitcoin miners to heat the room that we start some of our plants in. And I've got from our son, he's in the Coast Guard. I have 2 grandchildren, one of which is old enough to be able to work in the gardens whenever they're up here. They're now down in Florida. And you can type in the chat, but it's like essentially, do you have a garden that could be at least 25 by 25 feet? Do you grind your own flour? Do you cook with whole grains? Are you growing grains now? So I unfortunately can't see chat. How do I do that? How do I bring chat back up? Here we go. So is anybody already growing grains? We got one yes. In the past, not yet. Amaranth, okay. I'll mention that. Have a garden. All right, so if you've got a garden, you've essentially can start. And it really depends on the scale of things. So what you plant depends on what you want to do with it. So if you just want to make some side dishes, you could grow flint corn or barley, wheat, rice, sorghum, millet, or amaranth. That's pretty easy and fairly easy to process. A little more work and a little more equipment is to be able to make flour. You could make that from wheat, buckwheat, millet, sorghum, or corn again. Even more work, you could grow sorghum and make syrup to put on your pancakes that you made with the flour. So the cycle starts, I can't read the top of my screen because of a bar, control bar. Anyway, we start in the late fall, which is now, and we're winding down the harvesting of the grains we planted last fall and this spring. I'm almost completely finished cutting the wheat. I've got one variety left. And then next is why do we plant in the fall? Some grains can be planted in the spring, some must be planted in the fall, and some can be planted both ways. But the fall planted grains tend to, you harvest them earlier in the spring before it's really hot. For me, they tend to yield more. So the fall is the best time to plant wheat, and rye, and some barleys. But you can't plant it too soon. There's a fly that can damage the grain. So in our area, we want to plant mid-September. If you plant too soon, this fly lays an egg and the larva will damage the plant and it won't survive the winter. So what you're going to see in the pictures is what this plant looks like, because it doesn't seem natural to garden now and then have it survive the winter, but that's the way it works. So what do? You essentially till like any other garden plot. This is the tiller. Prepare the soil like a nice seed bed. I tend to till, and then a few days later, a week later, use a rake it smooth, and knock over any of those freshly sprouted weeds before I start laying out what I'm going to plant. Now, what might come to mind is planting like these pictures, Paul Engel's The Little House on the Prairie, very romantic, nice furrows. But it's a very wasteful way of planting seeds. It's very quick because you can fling the seeds with your hand and then drag something to fill the little furrows in. But you essentially put out way more seed than you would have if you've done it any other way. But if you had a large area of plant, that's how they used to do it. Something slightly more modern, but costing too much money for those of them on the home scale is these kind of seed planting devices, ranging anywhere from single row, like in the lower left, something you pull with a tractor. Again, that's too much for us. And the size of what you plant. This is back to what do you want to do? Why are you doing this? If you're just wanting to plant some grains to have as a side dish versus you want to feed yourself and your family for a year, those are two completely different scales. So you can very much start out on a small scale, and I'll give you some numbers coming up. One word of caution: everyone thinks ancient grains, einkorn, and emmer. Those ancient grains have a hull. So you see the picture on the left. There's a white-colored shell, let's call it, around the seed. Where on the right, that wheat has no hull. That hull is very difficult to remove on a home scale. Traditionally, you would have pounded it in a mortar and pestle and had some of your children do this every day and pick out the bits. Very, very labor intensive. So einkorn and emmer grow nicely and are not bothered by bugs much, but they're very difficult to use on a home scale. If you wanted to make a 1 pound loaf of bread, you need about 3 cups of flour. And for that, you need about 2.5 cups of the wheat berry seeds. So jumping to the bottom line here, essentially a 5 foot by 5 foot plot would give you enough flour to make your loaf of bread, your 1 pound loaf of bread, give or take. All things depend on the weather and the critters, but that's a good starting point. And as a reference, in the Victorian era, back when people didn't have motors to do the work for them, a family of 6 would eat 55 pounds of bread every week because they got their calories from bread. And that works out to be about 3,000 pounds of wheat they would need. So you need about 2 acres of well-tended wheat to produce your 3,000 pounds of wheat to feed your family for the year, just as a sense of scale. So 2 acres would get you the bulk of your calories. If you were making, this is a bread, there are some recipe slides later, but just the loaf we like to make uses 3 cups of white flour from the store and 2 cups of homegrown ground whole wheat. When you grind wheat yourself, you end up with everything. It's like 100% whole wheat. It's a little heavier than the whole wheat you buy from a grocery store. They do a little bit of filtering. So again, we're somewhere in the 4 foot square. So if you wanted to bake a dozen of those, you'd need about a 15 foot by 15 foot plot. So, 15 by 15 could be a piece of your normal garden. You do just have to remember you don't want to till it. You don't want to turn it under when you till the rest of your garden. So you have to choose where you put it so that you don't run it over, and you may want to protect it from the rabbits. If you're going to have barley as a side dish, so you let's say a half a cup of barley for 2 or 3 people as a side dish. I'll show you some pictures. You're in a little less than 3 foot by 3 foot plot to make your dish. So if you're willing to give up 30 foot by 30 foot, you could have this side dish 2 times a week for a year. Now for the kinds of equipment, we're back to the depends on the scale. So if you think in square feet on the left, if you're in a 10 square foot, you're just growing some grain for decorating, and maybe to see how they do, grow out some seeds. You can do everything with a little hand hoe. When you're into the 100 square feet, you're still just tasting things and having a holiday treat. You might want to hoe for that. When you get to 1,000 feet, so that's still only like 33 by 33. You're starting to want a tiller. You still could use a hoe, but you're getting bigger. Once you're into the 10,000 square feet, so that's 1/4 of an acre. Now you need tools with wheels. For example, a wheel hoe. I've got pictures of that. By the time you're into 100,000 square feet, you're talking 2 acres. Now you could do a lot of things by hand. People did it, but it's time. How much time do you have? And anything bigger than that, you're into some serious tractors and serious investment. So we work in about 40,000 square feet range in what we grow in our seed company. Oh, I kind of skipped that part. My wife has a company called Great Lakes Staple Seed, and I specialize in growing the grains for her, the grains that we're talking about tonight. She works on growing the beans and the squash and the tomatoes and the peppers. So once you've decided how big you're going to plant and you've prepared your soil, for wheat, let's use wheat as an example, you want to end up with the seed about a good solid inch below the surface. That's after the soil is packed. You need it deep enough so that it gets the moisture, and you need it deep enough so that the plants don't fall over in the winter, because they're going to have to survive the frost, the heaving frost. And if it's too shallow, they'll fall over or be damaged by the cold. About an inch is enough. These are the main tools. I like to use a steel yard rake for smoothing that soil after tilling. You don't have to, but I like to use a wooden seed bed prep rake. It's a little bit finer than the steel one, and it picks up all the dead weeds and bits and pieces and whatnot. And I like to scratch the lines with another rake that has only 4 teeth, so that I can make all my lines parallel and evenly spaced because I'm an engineer. And I like to weed with a hoe dog, the handheld hoe. Here's what that looks like. That tool, just scratch out some lines. I like to plant my rows about 9 inches apart. Any closer than that, I have trouble walking down them with the wheel hose, and I end up stepping on things. And any wider than that, and I feel like I am not squeezing as much onto the land as I could. I tend to put little strings to create plots like this so that I can do each section. So the planting starts to look like this. You see here on the right, the furrows that were made. You can make those with a hoe. I use a wheel hoe. I'll show you that in a moment. After the seeds are planted, walk along from the side and using the rake to pull the soil back in to fill up the furrows. And then I like to walk back and forth and tramp it all down so it's packed nice and solid, because the seed needs to be firmly held in the soil for it to germinate properly. And then often I'll rake back over the soil to cover up all the footprints and whatnot, because birds will come along and pick my seeds out, and I want to make it as difficult for them as possible. Here's what those furrows look like. I don't get a rule around. It's essentially, if you've got nice soil and you make your spacing at about 9 inches, essentially you get the sawtooth mountains of the ridges of the soil, and that gives you about a little around the inch that you need. So it works out. If you have lumpy clay soil, and we have some of that, it's a little harder to make them pretty. You may have to increase to 10 inches in order to get a good clean furrow that you can work with. But nice loamy soil, this picture, if I go back, this is what you think of in that medieval picture where Charles Ingalls was flinging the seeds around. So here's what a wheel hoe looks like. This one's from Earthworks, I think, made in maybe Ohio or Indiana. And it is essentially, you can make a furrow by walking as fast as you can. I normally go over the furrow twice, once to make the line so I get the spacing just right, and then the second time I pay a little more attention to the depth. And if you do it right and you walk with it to your side, you can create 3 or 4 rows next to each other, and then you can start putting the seeds in. You don't need the wheel hoe until you start talking about several thousand square feet, because you're trying to plant everything. The ideal time is, let's say, September 15th. You really don't want to spend a month planting, so you do need some efficiency of scale and borrow your children and spouses to help. So this is what it looks like once all the seeds are in. The soil is tromped down and raked across. It looks nice and smooth. And what typically happens is, by the time I run out of space, my early work is already sprouted, like in these pictures on the right. You can see the little green plants popping up. And now the weeding begins. Internet connection is unstable in the modern world. You could do the weeding with the hoe dog. You could do it with a hoe. I like to use this other wheel hoe that's got little cutter bars, and the 2 wheels straddles the little row of plants. So essentially, pretty much as fast as you can walk, with one eye on the wheels, one eye on the cutters, one eye on the plants ahead of you, and one eye on your feet. Just walk along and it chops the weeds. And now that everything is growing, I'll show you what those look like in the spring. You essentially wanted the plants to grow 2 inches or so tall and be nice and healthy when winter comes, and then the plant just goes dormant. You may have to protect it from rabbits if you've got a lot of rabbits. It's okay if they nibble some. It will grow back, but you will weaken it. So I try to keep the rabbits out. So what do you do during the winter? When you're growing grains in the winter, you eat. And I searched the internet. So here's a picture of medieval people feasting, enjoying the fruits of their labor. So if you made grain, you could be simmering it, grinding it into flour, or roasting it. Flint corn is something that most people don't think about growing. It's very easy to grow and it's very productive. You can make cornbread, cornmeal, pancakes, polenta. or you can nixtamalize it and make masa and make tortilla type things. You might cook the grain and roast it in a squash like this. We grow squash, so we have a lot of squash to eat. Most of these grains, if you think rice, wheat, sorghum, barley, it's essentially one part grain, 2 parts water, and simmer it for 20 to 25 minutes. That's all it takes to eat the grain, nothing fancy. Let's see. Here's a picture that the bread I like to make with 2 cups of whole wheat flour ground by us and 3 cups from the store-bought white flour. If you're going to make, this is what polenta looks like. It's essentially a cup of the cornmeal and a couple cups of water, maybe a pinch of salt and a little bit of butter, and you spend an hour or 2 slowly cooking it until it's thick. Try not to burn it, and you want it thick enough so that it doesn't run around on your plate. You could use it as like a substitute for mashed potatoes. And any leftover, you just add a little more flour, make it thick, and then the next day you can fry it as a patty, like hush puppies. These are buttermilk pancakes. I wish I could make that thing at the top go away. Uh-oh, that's bad. All right, I'm back. Buttermilk pancakes, that's I like to use some of our grain for. As the winter progresses, the other thing you can be doing is planning how much garden space, and some hints on you should save your own seeds. We sell very small quantities of seeds, and we expect everyone to grow them and save them and grow them again and never have to buy that variety again. So to keep the plant varieties pure, there are some rules. Wheat and barley are easy. They self-pollinate. So as long as you don't plant 2 varieties of wheat where they can touch each other, there will be no unauthorized mixing. Beans need 20 feet, rye needs more, and so does corn. But if you're just if you don't care, you still can plant them. You may get something slightly different, but it might be better. That's a good time to purchase. We tend to open our internet sales up late December. Bulk of the people are shopping in the January, February timeframe. And of course, you have to keep warm. As spring comes, it's time to think about turning over the soil. We use a tiller. We don't practice any no-till. I've studied it in some commercial-sized farming operations, and there's some very specialized equipment you need for that, and it doesn't exist on the home scale. So I'm always in the battle against the weeds and the deer and the rabbits. When the soil is wet, you do have to be careful not to overwork it. That will make it clump together. And here's some pictures of what those fall planted grains look like in the spring. They tend to be flattened down due to the snow. Sometimes they look pretty sad, but when those warm days start coming, plant growth is driven by warmth. So any day that's over 40 degrees, the plant is starting to grow. So they'll very quickly go from this rather boring looking picture. And as a time check, the lower left, that's your rhubarb coming up. So when the rhubarb is emerging, the grains have a hint of green and are starting to wake up. Now you see a little more life in them. And it's time to be thinking about planting the spring grains. So the amazing thing about spring wheat is that you can plant them when the soil temperature is only 37 degrees Fahrenheit. So we actually use a thermometer, because that's a common mistake people make, is to plant many things too soon. So it's pretty hard to plant spring wheat too soon, but you can see that, soybeans and beans and sunflowers, they need pretty warm soil. So you can't be planting those in Michigan in April. but you can be planting wheat and barley. And as May goes on, comes the corn. By the end of May, we start thinking about warmer things. In the very first days of June, everything goes crazy. Plant as fast as you can. Sometimes I plant the spring barley and wheat, and it'll snow, which of course is horrifying, but it's okay. Plants are there's at this point, these haven't emerged. They're down in the soil, and the snow is there. No, it's no problem. Planting in the spring is just like planting in the fall. The same soil prep, the raking, the furrowing, making sure you label everything. It just goes much faster because the spring grains want to get in as soon as the soil is workable. So I normally start in the middle of April, but that's driven heavily by the weather. If the soil's too wet, I have to wait. And this is an example of a rye cover crop that I'm turning under. So the rye was planted in the fall. Now it's growing, and I'm turning it in as green manure for the soil, for soil health. Here's that wheel hoe. This one's, the brand is TerraTech. It was rather expensive, but if you were going to plant a half an acre of something, it's worth having the right tools. And most people just use a hoe or a scuttle hoe. Works for a couple thousand square feet. Here's what the picture on the lower right shows you, those little cutter blades that are below the surface. So you can adjust the gap and go down every other row. So here's pictures of, this is spring. Sardinian barley is a spring barley. So you see my 9-inch spacings. It's something I have a lot of seeds of, so I'm not dropping the seeds one by one to get 8 inches or so between seed. I'm just sprinkling them, and I'm aiming for one plant every 4 inches would be super. If I get them a little too thick as I'm hoeing, I might just chop a few out. If they're too thick, the problem is the plant will become very leggy and stemmy, and it'll fall over. So then you end up with the ripening grains laying in the dirt. So that's not good. So too thick is bad. Too thin is okay. It's a waste of space, but it's better than too thick. And what happens is that one seed, as it grows, it sends up these tillers or side shoots. So one seed produced that plant that's in this picture. And every one of those tillers, well, not everyone, but most of them will make a head of grain. So one seed makes many stems, and every stem might make 40 seeds. So it's an amazing multiplication effector. It's really what drove the food that created civilization thousands of years ago, was the ability to grow these kind of calories to feed your family quickly and efficiently. So here's the setting sun across a wide range of different kinds of wheats and barleys. Every one of those orange sticks is a tag telling us what's in that little rectangle. Because once you harvest seeds, it's very hard to know. You can't tell by the look of a seed to know which one it is. You've got to have complete traceability through the tagging system, because maybe some grain grows only a foot tall, other grain might grow 5 foot tall. It's completely different. As a time check, this is the time when we're planting potatoes. So when the potatoes are going in the ground is when the grains are in this couple inches tall, beautiful green stage. So again, it's a race of time. Some of the problem with time is because we plant several hundred varieties, and every variety has to be handled individually, we don't get any efficiencies of scale. So if you were growing to feed your family, you might only want 4 or 5 varieties that have different timing. So now, as those potatoes are in the ground, you don't want to rush the corn, buckwheat, sunflowers, amaranth, millets, and sorghums, because they're a little more sensitive to the cold soil, but their time will come. And here's pictures of grain as it's growing. It goes from, this is full castor. It's a fall planted wheat. What happens is those warm days, the plants grow rather slowly, and then all of a sudden they start gaining inches. What seems like every day they gain a couple inches. They just grow in a growth spurt, and it's amazing to watch. This is a barley. You can see, I've got my 4 inches or so between plants. What you're doing is, with the right spacing, the plant is creating shade. So once you've done the weeding in the spring, if you can get it to this stage, the plants will shade out the weeds and take care of themselves for the rest of the season. Meanwhile, the potatoes are growing and the potato bugs are coming. Now the amaranths and the millets and the sunflowers are up at that time when the potato bugs are coming. We grow 2 kinds of amaranths: a red leaf amaranth that makes a little black seed. Amaranth is nice in that you can eat the leaves like spinach, but the plant doesn't bolt like spinach does in the summer heat. So it's kind of a all-season spinach, and it's healthy. We also grow millet and sunflowers. And while those sunflowers are in a couple inches tall, you see the barley are the first to produce their grain heads. I think this is quite attractive. This is Karen 16. And meanwhile, the beans are up, and you might be making hay or gathering cut grass for mulch. Meanwhile, the barleys are continuing to form their seeds and ripen. Some people like these barleys for just decorating because they're so pretty. This is corn. Corn now is in the 6 to 9 inches tall at this time in the summer. And meanwhile, the grains are each of those. This is that same picture I showed you with the snow from that year. So every one of those little rectangles is a different kind of grain. You've got different kinds of barley, different kinds of wheat. As the summer progresses, now is the time to keep an eye on when are you going to start harvesting. So that's a common question. Grain, the little seeds, the best way to tell when you as a home grower should harvest is the condition of the seed. If you pick one seed off and squish it between your fingers, it goes through a series of stages. At the beginning, when it's green, it's watery and milky and oozes. Then it becomes like soft cookie dough. Then it becomes like hard, dried out bread dough, and then becomes completely hard. So we can cut it in the soft dough stage because we're not going to move it through a giant combine. The combining guy, the modern farmer, he has to wait until it's completely hard, like brittle, because the machine is going to damage it if it's too soft. But what the people did in the past is they would cut it in the soft dough stage, which is just before the birds want to eat it as well, and before the seeds would drop to the ground. And they would make the bundles and make the shocks and stack them up in the field, like very romantically. But that's really to let the grain dry under control. The modern farmer, he needs the seed to be hard, and he has to have the whole field ripe at the same time. If you're doing it by hand, you don't. So this is the same idea with just different pictures. So you're looking at the seed and you're feeling the seed. You want it to be hard dough, in the soft dough to hard dough, more to the hard dough side, not completely hard and brittle. So these are pictures of grains that are nearing, the stage. So when they start getting this pretty color golden, I'm out there every night picking a few seeds off each one, looking for who's going to be next, who's going to be ripe for the next day. And different kinds of wheat look differently. Some have awns, like if I go back, this one has awns, the whiskers. Those are really nice for keeping some critters from eating them. Modern wheat doesn't have it. It's all the energy goes into the seed. Modern wheat tends to be short, which means you need herbicides to kill the weeds. We don't use any herbicides, so we have weeds. Sometimes more, sometimes less. So back before the 1950s, especially before 1940, grain was tall because you needed the straw for the animals, for the horses that you use in the field. Around 1950, they found a mutation in Japan that they bred into modern wheat that makes the wheat short so that the plant doesn't waste any time making straw because they didn't need it. They had tractors, they had petroleum. So the other advantage of tall, besides the straw for the horses, is tall wheat and barley and rye are good at shading out the weeds because they didn't have herbicides. So at our scale, we tend to harvest with a pocket knife or a hand sickle like this picture, or scissors. My wife prefers scissors because if a particular variety that's 5 foot by 5 foot is ripe, it's not that much work to cut it no matter what. At that scale, we really can't use any kind of scythe or anything. I've tried, but it's too difficult to deal with a small amount. So what we do is we cut these little bundles like this, and we'll tie them and label them, and we'll hang them in the barn where they can finish ripening and drying, and no birds can get to them. This is another kind of wheat, Banatica, I think, very good bread wheat from the Ukraine area. This is a barley. You can see these awns, these whiskers are very good at protecting the grain. You don't want to get those in your clothes. They're like very prickly. Meanwhile, the grain is ripening. More pictures of ripening grain. What happens when you plant the fields with different kinds is you can greatly see the variety and the different colors and the different looks. Makes it harder to find those orange tags though, but they're in there. Here's a good example of, on the right, we make bundles about 4 inches in diameter so that there's still good airflow, and we'll just carry those to the barn and hang them up from the rafters. If you don't have a barn, some people use their porches or any covered area. If you had nothing, you could stack them in the field like an Amish picture of the little stooks all stacked up, and you could read on the internet how you make the top one help keep the rain around. But because we're a seed company, we're doing our best to strive that the seeds are extremely high quality. So we bring them inside. This is that red leaf amaranth that I showed back in the middle of June. It forms these big seed heads, red seed heads. These we grow 2 kinds, like I said before. This black seeded one we always grow in one plot, and we grow the hot biscuit, kind of a yellow seed, in another plot. The red leaf one likes to self-feed. You'll end up with billions of these little red plants, even though you didn't want the seeds to fall in the ground. The plant is really good at it, but you get enough seeds for yourself from threshing those. We do the same thing. When the seed heads get heavy, we start feeling them and rubbing them between our fingers to see what the little black seeds look like. And it's a delicate balance between what's tomorrow's weather, what's today's weather. Are the seeds, are they coming loose, and are they looking plump? If so, we'll cut it and hang it up, especially if a storm is coming, because heavy rain and wind will knock the seeds loose, and you won't get as much. Another one that pops up all the time is quinoa. It grows fairly well. It's actually quite well. It looks like a weed. It is a variant of a weed, pigweed. Makes a little seed that looks like a little cylinder. You really have to wash the seed. It has a soapy coating. Our only complaint with that is it's from the area, it's from the Andes, right? And this plant expects a dry fall. In Michigan, about the time the seeds are ready, we start to get the fall rains, which were good for the grain we just planted. But now the little seeds will germinate, so you can really miss it. If you miss by one day and a rain comes, the seeds will sprout, and you get a poor quality seed. So it sounds like a good plant. It is in many parts of the country, but it's not really the best plant for Michigan. We think amaranth or millet is better if you're going to try to feed yourself. Here's a picture on the right of some of those bundles of grain hanging from the rafters of the barn. We have lots of little strings that we hang things up. And we might, on the left here, we have a big fan that we like. When we first hang the grains, we'll turn the fan on to stir up the air. You don't have to do that, but we end up with quite a bit of grain hanging in the barn, and it becomes noticeably humid as things are drying, and more grains get hung from the rafters. All labeled, of course, because no label is feeded to the chickens. After a couple of weeks, the grain is completely dried down, and now the seeds would be really hard and would crack if you crunch them. You could grind them into flour. When they're soft, you can't grind them. For small scale people in the garden scale and us, you just take the heads of grain like in the top left and rub them through a screen or rub them between your hands, and you'll end up with what's in the lower right here. The bottom pictures is essentially the chaff and the seeds. And it's the good old separating the seeds from the chaff. This is another way you could do it is instead of rubbing it between your hands, put the grain into a pillowcase or empty feed sack and beat it with a rubber hose. Stomp on it. They used to use animals to stomp on them or a flail. Rubber hose works the best. Now to separate them, this is the method that we found that works the best on the home scale. Is you just need an electric fan and some plastic shoe boxes. So in the top right here, the chaff and the seeds, you pick the shoe bin up and you pour it in front of the fan on the short edge of the shoe box, and it kind of makes a waterfall of grain. Well, what happens is the seeds fall into the bin closest to the fan, and the bigger bits fall into the second bin, and the fluffy stuff flies to the left. Don't do this inside the kitchen. We do it outside in the barn. And so you then take the bin with the seeds and pour it again in front of the fan, and usually within a couple of passes, you've got pure seed, and you're done. If you had much more space, garden, like an acre ground, you might want this kind of pedal thresher. This does the work of the beating and the much more efficiently, but it's rather expensive. So you only need that kind of efficiency if you have an acre. The corn is actually the easiest. When the ears are dry, we again pick them before the birds can get them, and we lay them on the floor and let them harden up. And then to shell them, the easiest way is just use your hands with gloves, or you can buy this little corn sheller thing for $10 from Amazon on the right. If you have lots and lots of corn, you might want this kind of hand crank machine that takes the seeds off the cobs. We do everything by hand so that we don't damage the seeds. It is kind of rough on your fingerprints. It does wear them down, but we do it throughout the winter, so it's okay. If you planted rice, the challenge with rice is there is a kind of hull that needs to be removed. From the internet, you can build this kind of machine that's got two rollers in it that removes the hull, or you can buy this electric machine from Japan that takes the hulls off. But the rice we grow looks like wheat. The upland rice doesn't require a flooded paddy like you think of when you think of Japanese rice. Once you've winnowed that grain, how are you going to make flour? So if you have a mortar and pestle, this is how they used to do it long ago. So you would beat your grain with the pestle or the mortar in the pestle and run it back through a few times and sift it out, and you'll get a coarse flour. Then people moved up to the quern. You rotate this, and it grinds the seeds into flour. Not very big. The small one you can buy on Amazon. It's a little on the small side. You can buy a slightly larger one with a handle. Now you could make some serious flour. But to be honest, these days, most people are going to buy something like this. There's a wide range of flour grinders that are hand powered. This one is from Grainmaker, and very with it, 5 minutes work, you can grind all the flour you need for a loaf of bread, maybe even less. Or if you're really, if your arms are tired easily, just buy this attachment from Mock Mill that goes on your KitchenAid, and away you go. That's the fastest. This is usually the way we do it. The hand way is cute, but takes time. Time is always short. We tend to grind the wheat directly into whole wheat flour, and we don't sift it. But in reality, whole wheat flour from the store actually has some of the bran sifted out. So you could buy a screen and sift that out if you want. Make it a little lighter. As the summer progresses, these are oats. They get cut and done the same way. And this is that same little field that I showed you with the snow on the ground. All the little patches are being harvested one by one as they ripen. And oats, some varieties of oats stand about 4 feet tall. Again, they were very good at shading out the weeds underneath them. And here's some pictures of different kinds of grain seeds. So there's many kinds of wheat. Imagine that. There's some wheat that's best for growing, for making bread. Hard red wheat is for bread. Soft wheat is for cookies. And there's some grain that's so special they used it to make the bread only for the king. There's some kinds of wheat, like durum, are for making noodles. And barley is the same way. Some are for eating, like these. These are naked, which means they have no hull. Or the barley may have a hull, like these pictures. You see the little shell. These are very difficult to dehull. Instead, these varieties were specialized for making beer or animal feed. And once you've threshed and cleaned all your seeds, you should store them, label them, of course, is very important. You really want an airtight container. You want to keep them cool. There is a grain weevil that will attack your seeds, but if you freeze your seeds for at least 5 days, it will kill the little bugs and keep them clean. So we run everything through the deep freezer to get rid of the weevils. Otherwise, they'll hatch when it gets warm and makes a mess. Other grains, as I'm zipping here near the end, this is West African millet. Kind of looks like it's very strange looking. Those little seeds are on the outside of the head, like you see on the lower right. Limelight millet, very popular in bird seed. You do have to work hard to keep the birds away from this one. We put little bags over the best heads to save them. Very productive though. This is another kind of millet. It kind of makes this dragon claw looking thing. For some reason, the birds that eat up the limelight don't like the looks of this one, so they tend to leave it alone. Other grains you could grow in are sorghum. Sorghum comes in some that you use for the seeds, and some you use for feeding animals, and some you use for making brooms, and some you use for making syrup. So you don't want to plant the wrong one for the wrong use. We like to grow Rock's orange, which was developed about 100 years ago in Wisconsin for making syrup. And sorghum syrup tends to show up during times of famine and wars. It's a substitute for sugar. And you can't get sugarcane from that part of the world. Plant gets pretty tall, and let's see, in your mind, this is how they used to make it, and they still occasionally do in historical reenactments. But if you don't have one of these 1-ton presses and a donkey in your yard, you can use, I know somebody who used a mop wringer. You can buy electric juicers you might have for making juices. You could buy some machines from Alibaba and eBay and Amazon, or something bigger that you press like this from Grainacre. Get a juice that looks green. It looks kind of bad, but you boil it down 10-to-1, so it's much easier to make sorghum syrup than it is to make maple syrup. We tend to use a big jelly pot like this, and we do it on the stove. We don't sell it. We just make it for ourselves and for gifts. You essentially boil it until you get the consistency you want, and we use it on those cornbreads. So that was a kind of a high-level overview of grain processing. You know, the steps go through the cutting it in the field, the bundling it up, the hanging it to dry, picking out which seeds you're going to plant the following year, threshing it, winnowing it with the fan, screening it to get rid of any little seeds, the freezing to kill the wiggles, and then the eating. And this is the last slide. So to find these slides, if you went to Google and searched for Great Lakes Staple Seeds, that's our company, and the word education, it'll take you to a page where we've posted all of the training materials we've produced over the last 5 years, including one on solar systems and the specifics of the processing of the grain, and different versions of this one about the growing of the grain. So I see there's 9 entries in the chat. So I'd say, Joe, let's open it up to questions.
Sure. Yep. Please feel free to type in questions to the chat, and I'll kind of help moderate and read them out to Scott.
Okay. First question I see that I can answer: I grow buckwheat for ground cover as well. No idea how to harvest the grain. Buckwheat is an interesting plant in that it'll keep making seeds as long as it's not killed by the frost. So at some point, the seeds will start to fall off. So before they're falling off, the plants, the stems start to turn reddish. You know, they change from green to some pretty colors. And what happens is you don't want to pull the seeds off the plant. You want to cut the plant down at the ground level and tie it in a bundle and hang it for about a month. And what'll happen is the plant will take the energy from the stems and it'll finish ripening the half-finished seeds. And so you'll end up with all the seeds finished, and the seeds will get very delicate. So after that month, when you take it down and you put it in a pillowcase and whack it with a hose or use your hands, the seeds will just fall right off. And then to cook it, what we do is we crack it with a rolling mill, and we use a screen to sift out the flour to make pancakes. Buckwheat, amaranth, nice, cool. Zone 9B. So sorghum for animal feed, that's a different kind of sorghum than the sorghum we grow for syrup. I think it's called Sudan. Where's 9B? 9B is warm. Very warm. I think in 9B you could grow anything. Anything we can grow, you can grow, just at a different time. I do know, like right now, this summer, the people growing sorghum for syrup in the South have had a lot of issues with aphids. Some years are bad, some are not. Do we give tours? No, we don't give tours. We've been thinking about we have a GoPro where we're going to make some virtual tours, but our insurance agent doesn't think tours are a good idea. Speaking of birds that eat the grains, I don't have problems with pigeons, but the sparrows are the worst, and the starlings cause us problems. Some grains without awns, we have some nets. So there are a lot of work to set up. You really have to protect the grains without awns. That's why we preferred awned grains. That's traditional. There must be a reason why our ancestors did that. Also, we haven't done it yet, but we're thinking about buying for next year an electronic bird chasing thing, but it's rather expensive. I'm told it works, but it essentially plays the sounds of different kinds of birds in distress and sounds from birds that eat birds, and scares away the sparrows, but sounds optimistic. Thank you. Wondering what berries I get from. Yes, the wheat berries you buy, unless they've been dried with high heat, can be planted. You won't probably know what they are. You won't know whether they were meant to be planted in the spring or in the fall. You could ask whoever grew them; they might know. But yeah, they definitely would grow. We are in Florida. I don't tend to think of grains in Florida.
But reach out to the Ag Extension.
My wife suggests talk to your local Ag Extension agent to see what the special requirements for wheat and barley in your area are. Do you naturally handle unwanted critters once grains are bundled and hanging? In the barn, we don't have problem with mice anymore because we have a lot of barn cats. There's Facebook farming group has some program where you can adopt cats that are deemed unwanted by people. So we do that every now and then, and they live the good life in the barn. We feed them as well, but the presence of the cat seems to take the spirit out of the mice. How do you turn sunflower seed into grain? We eat the sunflower seeds by breaking the shell and picking the little meat out. We learned to do that in China. You can buy a machine that would squeeze the sunflowers to get the oil out. That's how we eat them. Why have you not mentioned oats? I planted oats in there. If you plant oats, there's two kinds of oats. Oats with hulls, which are good for animal feed, and oats that are hullless, which don't yield as much, but can be eaten by humans. So make sure you plant hullless oats. They grow very much like spring planted grains. Cat wants in. They grow very well. Their oats are one of the first things. They like to be planted very early. They like the cold, cool weather. How much would you need to plant for family 6 to make sorghum? What type of seed would you plant in southern Oklahoma? In southern Oklahoma, for sorghum, you could plant any of our varieties. There are many varieties that can take advantage of your longer day, the longer days of a longer season in Oklahoma. We use Rock's Orange because that's about as far north as people could grow sorghum commercially, because it can handle the short season. Let's see. How much to plant would depend what you're going to eat, the grain or whether you want the syrup. Do you let both grow? Do you let both grow? Okay, spring and fall. So the fall planted grains are harvested in the early part of the summer, so like the middle of July. The spring planted grains start coming along by the very end of July or the beginning of August. So they're all, like right now, they're all just about finished. Yes, and each variety is different. There are some varieties that come the soonest, that come the quickest. So for example, we know which varieties of fall planted barleys will be the first ones to be harvested. So now we group them together. The tricky part about the spring grains is right when you're trying to plant is when it's raining. So that's another advantage of fall planted grains is we tend to have in September, there's usually some nice weather before we get the rainy fall. If you can get it all in before the rain comes, that's great. Can a crow? Oh yeah, the crows would eat grains, but we don't see very many crows in our apartment. We have a lot of hawks. Wow, hawks, I think help chase some of the birds away, as well as some of our chickens. Okay, that's the last comment. Joe, do you see any other comments that I missed, questions that I missed?
Nope, I believe you caught everybody. Oh, here's one from Jennifer. To follow up on previous question, any suggestion for keeping away mice in suburbia?
No barn cats. The neighbor feeds the feral cats, so they're lazy about catching mice. There are traps. I have bought and set up mouse traps baited with peanut butter, and there are some traps that have like a swinging flap with a 5-gallon bucket of water. The mouse climbs on the plastic trap to get to the peanut butter and falls in the bucket and drowns. So if you're okay with that, it's deadly. It does work, but to be honest, I don't think we lose. Occasionally we'll have the chipmunk that drives us crazy, but we don't. I think because the cats and the hawks and all the other critters, coyotes, we don't have. Mice are not our problem. Sparrows are our problem. And you can buy a trap. We have some, and they are very effective. That can catch the sparrows. Then you just have to decide what you're going to do with them.
Well, great. That was a fabulous, authoritative presentation. Those photos were beautiful of the grain bundles hanging in the barn. Let's see. We're getting lots of thank yous, and I want to thank everyone. It looks like we had some people joining us from a distance. We're in Dearborn, Michigan, and maybe some folks from Florida or Oklahoma. Thank you for joining us. Everybody's welcome. If you happen by Dearborn, there are many cultural attractions here, and certainly stop by the libraries. I'd be happy to see you and show you the seed library here. So are there any things you'd like to close with, Scott, or we can shut it down?
Just remember, you can find the presentations through Google, and if you have any questions, you can either email me at scott_hucker@yahoo, or through the website. You'll find the company website, company email address. Also, I forgot to make one slide. There's a Facebook group called. There's a Facebook group that specializes in people growing grains on a small scale. Yeah. And there's people. It's people from all over the world. So that's an interesting place for people to share what they're doing and ask questions. And so my wife is writing down the name of it as best as she can. It's the small grains growing, just turn your laptop so I can read it. Growing grains on a small scale. Growing grains and cereal on a small scale. So that's a great place to ask questions of a group. So that's it for me.
Great. Scott and Eleanor, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we will have a recording of this posted to our YouTube channel. If you happened in late, you can go back and catch the first bit. All right, everyone, have a good night. We'll see you sometime soon.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, and thank you.
Good night, and thank you very much.